Hi, my name is Bill Schaeffer. We have another book review. Today's review is Excavating Jesus with John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan L. Reed, published by HarperCollins in 2001. Fascinating and scientific book that I think if you're interested in the archaeological record and what we know of historical facts at the time of Jesus, you'll find this to be amazing. At the beginning of the book, the authors identify 10 archaeological finds and 10 exegetical texts that their data is based on. And exegetical means literature that's outside of the Bible. These are texts concerning Jesus, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts, and certain literature discoveries they made. In the first chapter, in the beginning of the book, they really emphasize the fact of layering, and that our understanding of past events is through unfolding layers of events. And this is true in archaeology, where certain events are in certain strata, and they tell us about what occurred at that time, the date of that strata, but also in stories and also in texts themselves, as the stories are passed on through time and as the group matures. They identify 4 main archaeological layers, and that's from the mid-4th to the 7th century, the medieval layer. Then the Middle and Late Roman period is from the 2nd century to the mid-4th century. The Early Roman period is from the mid-1st century B.C.E., about 50 B.C., to the 1st century C.E., Common Era. And then the earliest strata is the Late Hellenistic period, which is the 2nd to mid-1st century B.C.E. Now, within those larger sections, they're divided into levels. And it helps to understand, particularly in the Jesus story, the general sweep of events that occurred. And there's several levels of the Jesus story that occurred. The first level was about 0 AD. That's where we kind of begin. But then there's also a level of the original teachings of Jesus, from about 20 to 40 CE in the Common Era. Then there's a second level after Jesus has died, from about 40 to about 60 CE. And this is when James was the head of the church and the martyrdom of James. Then the next level is from about 60 to 80, and this is the Jewish revolt against Rome and the destruction of the temple. Then the next level is from 80 to 100, and this is when the earliest Gospels were written. And that is kind of how all the events that occurred relate to each other in time. And so we can look at literature as coming from one of those times, and then the later time would be the 1st century from 100 to 200 Common Era. One thing I also like is they talk about Galilee and Nazareth. Now, at the time of Jesus, there almost wasn't a Nazareth. And it's really not mentioned in any of the literature of the time. And from the archaeological record, at best, it's a few huts, a few hovels, a few farmhouses, farm huts. And it was only 200 AD that Nazareth got built up the way it got built up. Now, another thing I like is they talk about different cities in Galilee and the history of those cities and whether they were Roman colonies or peasant communities, and what distinguished those cities from each other by architecture and location and history in the archaeological record. The author spent some time talking about King Herod and the history of Palestine, from the rebellion of the Maccabees through the building projects of King Herod, and particularly the large building projects of Caesarea, Maritima, of Masada, of his palace, and then also the Temple Mount. I especially liked the description of the architecture of the temple, and it gave me a better sense of what it would have been like to approach and enter the complex and be on the complex, and the scale of how huge it was and how it was separated into segments. In general, I like their archaeological descriptions of the architecture quite a bit, and it gave a good feeling for the environment. The authors also used the same idea of excavation to look at the literature in the Bible and what is known from a literature analysis of the Bible and other text resources, notably the Nag Hammadi texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, letters, the works of Josephus, and then the Bible itself. They talk about the Q source, the evolution of the Christian community, the difference between Jewish Christians and Gentiles. Then the author looks at specific events in the Bible and what we know about them and how likely they are to be true. And they approach the idea of truth in a scientific way, as truth is probabilistic. We will never know with 100% certainty what occurs anywhere, but we can have a great deal of certainty or uncertainty regarding certain events or certain ideas in history. And this is where the authors did a really good job, particularly with the story of Jesus and some of the key elements in the story of Jesus, and how the archaeological record supports or doesn't support different elements of the story. I can't go into everything here, but a few highlights that I found interesting. The Jewish homes were distinguished by a misquath, or a ritual bath, usually carved out of stone, too small for real bathing, and it wasn't a cistern because it actually had steps cut into it for walking into the water. And this was a common element in Jewish communities throughout Palestine and Galilee at this time. The Jewish communities were also distinguished by a lack of ostentation, a lack of display of wealth, use of stone vessels. And in fact, throughout Palestine, there was a thriving and vigorous stone cutting industry, and many utilitarian items were made of stone as opposed to being imported glass or imported metal items. And the authors talked a lot about the rebellion and what the rebellion meant to the people of the time. Now, at that time, Palestine or Israel was a colony. It was an invaded land that was run and administered by the Romans. And the Romans had reorganized the economy on more of a commercial or capitalistic money economy, whereas before the economy had been more of a sharing economy. And the Romans' efficiency introduced a great deal of disparity of wealth and ostentatious display. And both of these concepts were pretty much foreign before the Roman invasion and occupation. And just one way that there was a lot of disgruntled nature against the rule of Rome. because the ordinary peasants got poorer. The Roman rulers extracted more taxes and more fees from the peasants because the economy was basically an agricultural economy. So the common people got poorer, they lost their land, and the land was collectivized into large corporations. The same thing happened in Italy itself. This left a lot of disenfranchised people that had lost their family farm. That was very interesting. Also, the character of Pontius Pilate was very interesting, and he goes over the trial. In pretty uncertain terms, Pontius Pilate was known in his day by Romans as being ruthless and calculating and fearless and insulting and cold-hearted. And it's doubtful he would ever use wash his hands or defer authority. The authors talk about Jesus being king of the Jews and how that was a threat to Roman rule, and the two specific things that he did that by themselves would be considered actionable death offenses. And the one was the mockery of the procession by riding in on a donkey into Jerusalem. And then the second thing was overturning all the tables of the money changers and the merchants. And both of these were a direct threat to the power of Rome, and both of these referred to the earlier kingdom of trade and fairness versus the Roman rule of selling and buying and capitalistic endeavor. Also, the authors talk a lot about the concept of resurrection, and this I found to be fascinating, because in the first century, what the term meant was considerably different than what it means today, or the understanding was different. In the earliest times, the Jewish belief, there was no afterlife, heaven, or eternal life, or anything like that. When you died, you went down into the ground in a place called Sheol, and your life was perpetuated through your family, and your success and your honor was remembered through your living family and descendants. Well, through contact with the Persians and the Babylonians, there became this concept of heaven and an afterlife. And in the time of Jesus, it was the Pharisees that believed in this. The Pharisees believed in prayer, that God would hear your prayers, he would answer your prayers, that you had a soul that would live on. Now, the Pharisees believed more that there would be a corporal resurrection, that you died, you went into the ground, and at some time the Messiah would come, and everyone would come alive, and there would be the kingdom of heaven on earth. And this was the resurrection. And this explained their burial custom of, in the tombs, they would put people on a shelf, let them decay, and then collect the bones and put them in a little box called an ossuary that would be labeled. And frequently a number of people's bones were put in the same little stone box. This was so that at the end times, the people would still be able to be resurrected out of the ground and live again. Or the resurrection. This was the resurrection. So the significance of Jesus' resurrection was not that he was raised from the dead or resuscitated from the dead, but that it was symbolic of the beginning of this resurrection of the saints in the end times. And there's even a reference to that in Matthew, where when Jesus was resurrected, the saints were also resurrected and went walking through the city of Jerusalem, and people saw them. But those references were obscured in later versions of the story in what became the Bible that we know. I've only been able to mention some of the significant parts that really impressed me about the book. But if you're interested in history, the history of Roman times, and particularly the history of Palestine and Israel in the time of the Romans and the time of Jesus, and you're interested in what we know of historical facts in a scientific and really unbiased manner, I highly suggest Excavating Jesus by John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan L. Reed. It's a good summary of the current knowledge of the archaeology and the literature of the time of Jesus. Thank you, and leave your comments below.